Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats. We're about to begin our first session for today, which is titled Contemporary Fiction at Home and the Diaspora. And the panelists are Nikesh Shakla, Nikita Lalwani, Muneeza Shamsie, and Moni Mohsin. And our moderator for today is Mr. Salman Tarik Kureshi, who's an author, a poet, and has a long years of association with the Oxford University Press, and a great editor, Mr. Salman Kureshi.
Thank you, Hassan, and good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? No? This thing doesn't move. Is that better? Okay. So, I'm supposed to introduce the session, which I want to take as little time as possible to do, so that... No? No?
Is this on?
Like that. Oh, that's better. So I want to spend as little want to spend as little time as possible to do before we hand over to our respected panelists. But let me quickly introduce them. Starting on my left is Nikesh Shakla. Now I can read out from here, but the point is, the topic we're tackling is essentially the diaspora and home and anything else anybody can think of. Nikesh is a British writer of Indian origin. He lives in England and has written a novel called Coconut Unlimited, and which has been very well received. He is also involved with music and with the race situation in the UK. Correct? Okay, then also on my left is Nikita Lalwani. Now here we're getting a little closer to home because Nikita was born in India and lives in London, lives in England. And she has written two novels. The first one was called Gifted, about a gifted Indian child in the UK, and the second one is called The Village. She has also written essays on the riots recently in 2011 in the UK. On my right, Muneeza Shamsie, critic, editor, anthologist, and lady of letters. I think that's the accurate term. She's at the moment working on critical work on the development of Pakistani English literature. She's been my editor on a couple of things that I've done, creative work that I've done, and she has served as the regional chairperson of the Commonwealth Writers' Prize and on the jury of the DSC Prize of South Asian Literature. Beyond that, perhaps the best known to many in our audience here, Moni Mohsin is a journalist and a novelist. Moni belongs to the Punjab, to Lahore, lives in London mostly now, and she is well known for her column Diary of a Social Butterfly in the Daily Times, the Friday Times, I beg your pardon. And her session yesterday, I thought, which I attended, was rather well, very, very well received. But today we're not too worried about her as the social butterfly, but as a novelist for her novel, The End of Innocence, and another one that she is, I believe, working on. Moni's relation to the diaspora is that she lives there, she lives in London, but her roots here are very strong, particularly in the Punjab, as I'm sure she would agree. Having said that, brief introduction of the people, I just want to kick off on the topic. We use the terms diaspora and home with relation to fiction with a South Asian, let's say, link in one way or the other. My question that I'd like the participants to enlarge on is, are these really two alternate spaces providing a different kind of nourishment to the writer? I'm sorry if I'd like to move my face a little, but this thing doesn't allow me to. So, provide nourishment to the writer. Are these different creative spaces altogether, or are they really two parts of the same thing. I don't know, I have no answer to that, I'd like others to come in, because it's easy to contrast. You have let's say, the freedom and the breadth of the diaspora compared to the narrowness and the restrictiveness of home as literary environments, creative environments. You have the sense, the fact that most of us who have a liberal westernized education probably identify more easily with characters. I'm talking now here about the characters in the books. Characters and situations in novel, diaspora-related characters and situations in the novel, than with many in our home situation, whom perhaps we don't even know too much about, whom perhaps we either over-sentimentalize, or maybe we get carried away with the concepts of squalor and bombs. And so are we really talking about different things here, different environments, or not? And these are questions I'd like our panelists to enlarge on, and anything else they can think of which is relevant to contemporary fiction. What I'd like is, I don't want to have a rigid question and answer kind of format. I'd rather that each panelist took about 5-6 minutes to present a thought, and then I hope that the panelists will discuss between themselves. And please, to my panelists on either side, may I suggest, please have no hesitation in jumping in with your thoughts when anybody else is speaking, if you don't mind that. Because I'd like something, I don't know what's the right word, not dialogue, but quadrilogue, would that be the right word, to take place. Then at the end we'll try to have about 10-15 minutes for the audience to raise some questions. Okay, can we start off? We need somebody to go first, and what I thought was perhaps Muneeza could go first as
okay.
Don't
say another
topic
word.
Moving.
I don't know what that as what, but okay, I'll begin. I don't actually think that today there are lots of issues involved, actually. I don't actually think there's a very clear definition between home and the diaspora today, because of the internet, travel, and so on. And so, I mean, you get, like the three authors shortlisted yesterday. I mean, there's Mohsin, Uzma, and Nadeem. Well, you know, some of them were brought up here and lived abroad or have come back. Others keep traveling. And so this defining line becomes very blurred. And you have Moni here, for example, whose column, Social Butterfly, was actually a local newspaper column. And she continued writing it after she went away to England. And the Butterfly didn't change its tone. And then later on it became a diaspora book, a diaspora novel. So I think, but I would like to say one or two things about this. There are two things that have happened. And I do think that one of the things is that you often get in our newspapers, people sort of keep going on about English language writing being this elitist activity of the, you know, a certain class. And so when you write about a particular class to which you belong, it's, of course, these typical elitist people. This elitism is no longer so. A lot of people are using English. You've got people whose mother tongue was Urdu, whose mother tongue was Punjabi, who are now writing in English and writing novels. People like Musharraf Farooqi, people like Hanif, I think their first novel languages were not English. The other thing in the diaspora, what you've got is you've got a working class literature. You've got people whose parents were working class. They went and lived in Britain, and their children are producing a working class literature about life among factory workers. The response of that, because in Pakistan, again, it is a professional class that reads this literature, they tend to turn around and say, oh, well, they're catering to stereotypes, which is not true. They are portraying their lives that we haven't thought of in English, because in English we keep thinking of a particular milieu. So there are these lots of complex issues involved. Earlier on in the immediately after partition, I think there was a difference between home and diaspora because you couldn't leave the country. You were sort of, you had to get a P form, and it was such a palaver. So people were writing at home. They were writing in a kind of isolation. They didn't necessarily have exposure to Babsi Sitwa is certainly a prime example of someone who wrote very much at home, and then later she went to America and became Diaspora. And there was Zulfikar Ghosh, who was in the Diaspora, and we ignored all his novels because he wrote only one about Pakistan. And the critical discourse in that patriotic era, patriotic, was that you had to write about Pakistan if you were writing in English. Otherwise, everything else didn't count. So all his wonderful work about Brazil and about Europe was simply not known here. That's all I have to say for the moment.
Sorry?
Yeah.
Anybody else want to come in? Would you like to come in? Nikesh?
Okay. Hello.
Can you hear?
Is it turned up? I don't know.
I think you have to get rather close to it, as I discovered.
Okay. Oh, that's better. I hope I don't repeat anything that you said, because I can't actually hear anything that's happening.
You just speak up a little.
I don't know if I'm a diaspora writer or a writer about home. I think about this quite a lot because just because a book may feature characters of South Asian descent, does that mean that it is a book about being from South Asia, or is it just a book about people who happen to be from South Asian descent? Is their ethnicity integral to the plot? And then another thing that I think about quite a lot is I'm often described in my bio as a British Asian author, and I wonder how people like Jonathan Franzen would feel if people started describing him as American author or a white author. Is my ethnicity integral to what I'm doing in my novels? And I don't know if it is. It's a nice palette to have for me. Sorry, my mind's gone blank because I can't really hear myself.
I found that a little irritating too.
Yeah, sorry. So, a thing that Nikita and I were talking about earlier was when we were talking about the things that we talk about in this panel, we sort of have these. I have these perceptions of certain types of literature from the diaspora as being of a certain type, whether it's sort of frangipani literature or literature about mangroves, and often it doesn't necessarily come down to what the book's about. It comes down to how it's marketing, and I wonder if this sort of home versus diaspora is a thing that is perpetuated by how publishers decide to market books. So I'll leave it there on that contentious statement.
Would you like to?
Yeah.
Come in?
I think it's interesting to work out when you've got a word like home and when you've got a word like diaspora, whose home is it? So Muneeza raised the issue of free movement now, and the fact that it's not, that the restrictions aren't there that used to be there when you'd write from a home space, or back when things like imaginary homelands were being written, and there was the idea of yearning or nostalgia for a homeland. Now that you've got a second or a third generation growing up outside Pakistan, India, areas of the subcontinent, whose home are we talking about? I also think that, I was thinking about the philosopher Amartya Sen, who always talks about how any person has a plurality of selves. So whether you're in a village here in Sindh, or whether you're in Germany and of Austrian descent but with an Indian parent, or whether you're elsewhere on the planet, you would like to eat a certain thing, you would like to listen to a certain kind of music maybe, you would fall in love with a certain kind of partner who's your type, you may like to go fishing, and you may like to do certain other things. like swim. And those things are all relevant and, you know, unite us as human beings across the world. So back to this idea that Nikesh raised, is a story just a story? Is a family saga just a family saga? Whether it's, you know, an extended family in Pakistan on a soap opera on television, or whether it's Dallas, which I always thought was the ultimate extended family saga in America, a joint family. How different are things? But I also think there is an issue about class and particularity of experience, the individual experience. So I was thinking about class and elitism and the anxiety that we have. It's an anxiety that's shared across boundaries, I think. So my last novel, I wanted to write about a village in India. It's a village that is also a prison, but it's a village. And it requires people of different economic backgrounds to be written about. And an anxiety is there about detailing that experience in a respectful and unique and honest way that's not cliched. I was thinking about the writer Daniel Muneeza, who does that so well, I think, in his book. Who, when he writes about a Pakistani piece of land, and from the point of view of every single person who lives on that land, whether or not it's the woman who works in the kitchen, the landowner, the foreign returned daughter of the landowner who's a non-resident Pakistani. Everyone's experience is treated with the same level of humanity and the same kind of diligence. And so it can be done. I think we have an anxiety sometimes about writing outside a certain class. And if you didn't grow up in the subcontinent, that class is a very complicated thing. So Nikesh and I didn't come from rich backgrounds, and our families in the subcontinent are not from rich backgrounds. I come from a char-making family from Sindh, although they've all moved after partition to India. So class is a really tricky thing, and it comes back to being honest about the situation you're writing about. So you shouldn't fear writing about a situation because it's outside your experience. Write what you know, or you need to know it, whether or not you experienced it. But I do think that, you know, literature now is sort of much more wide-ranging and global in scope that's coming out of the subcontinent, and it's really exciting on that front.
Your novel was The Village, and Moni, your novel was also based in a village, right? At the End of Innocence. Would you like to come in there? No.
I don't think this is going to work here. No? Does it work? Can you hear?
Doesn't work at all?
No, I think they can hear. Okay.
Just a bit, little bit closer.
Well, I never really made the distinction in my mind between diaspora writing and the writing I was doing in Pakistan, because my writing career began in Pakistan, and then with journalism actually, and then when I moved to England, I didn't think, right, now I'm living in England, now my writing has to change, now I've become a diaspora writer. It was just a continuum, and I continued writing The Diary of a Social Butterfly. And then when I moved on to this novel, The End of Innocence, which is based on life in a village, I think that was a novel that I brought with me. It's a novel I'd carried with me for a long time. And I just, the writing of it was very natural to me. It came very naturally. I did not think that now that I'm based in England, it has to be a different kind of novel. I just wrote the novel which I had in me for a long time. But there is one thing that I have noticed, which is slightly different about writing in England, particularly in the time, my first novel came out in 2006. And when I gave it to my agent, and he began to send it around to publishers, some of the letters that I got back were from publishers who were slightly disappointed by my choice of subject, because they thought that because now 2001 had happened and Pakistan was in the front line on the war on terror, Pakistani writers should be writing on the war on terror, because that's what they wanted to read. And I have found that again and again and again. The minute, there are actually two strands. One that we were talking about earlier, which we call Frangipani literature, or mango literature, which is all about the exotic and the different. And if you're an Asian woman in particular writing, you have to be an exotic object yourself. And then you have to be dressed in a sari and wear kajal, and you have to be a particular kind of person and write a particular kind of story about arranged marriages or mango trees laden with heavy juicy fruit and that kind of thing. or you have to, then if you want to be a Pakistani living in the 21st century, you have to write about the war on terror. And you have to negotiate very sort of carefully where you want to go, because these are the two options open to you. But now I have to say, 13 years into the war on terror, they've had enough books on the war on terror, and I think people are now quite willing to engage with different things. But I think that the publishers may have moved on, but I think marketing departments perhaps in big publishing concerns, and also shop owners who have a great deal of power. I didn't know this before I became a published writer. That they decide. I don't know if you've had a similar experience, but a lot of what they want to stock is not about the book itself, but about on which shelf they're going to put you, on which table you're going to be. So they want even if a book is actually very different, it's a hard-hitting, edgy, gritty kind of novel, if it's going to be by an Asian, they want the kind of Asian cover so they can put it in the Asian slot. A friend of mine recently wrote a book, and it's going to be out in May, and it's set in 1960s Calcutta. And when he had his first meeting with the cover designer, he said to her, I have a checklist. I don't want any mangoes on the cover. I don't want sari on the cover. I don't want henna on the cover. I don't want big trees laden with juicy fruit on the cover. And I don't want desperate poor people on the cover. So this woman looked at him and said, and what do you want on the cover? So you have those kind of things, but I think it's gradually melting away, and I think people can now write and what they want and have the covers that they want as well. And be read just as writers, not be read as Asian exotic woman or as a brave Muslim woman speaking out against her class and against her repressive society. We don't constantly now have to write about, and now I don't have to write about drones. Somebody asked me yesterday why I don't write about drones, but you don't have to write about drones, you don't have to write about honor killings, you can write about what you want.
It's been, I think, the painful experience of all of those of us who have attempted to publish creative work that are trying to fit it into that shelf, as you said. But I don't know, has that also been the experience of someone like Nikesh here, who has been in the UK his entire life?
He's on the Brit-Asian shelf.
He's on the British.
I'm on no shelves.
Of course, your coconut characterization, brown on the outside, white on the inside.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little?
Well, I was just going to say a story similar to your one about the expectation of what you should write when it comes from publishers. It took a while for me to find a publisher for Coconut Unlimited, because it seemingly seemed bizarre that a brown guy from the suburbs of London would want to write a book about kids being into hip hop and rap music. So, and a note that I had back from a prospective agent once was he didn't feel that the characters were authentically Asian, and I said, why? I'm Asian. I wrote them. Do you mean they're not authentic? Have I not written them? And he said, no, they're great characters. They just don't feel very Asian because they weren't eating mangoes and having oppressive mothers forcing them into arranged marriages. It seemed bizarre to him that such a book could exist. Needless to say, I did not sign with this man. But because he didn't want to sign my book, not because I...
You want to come in, Moni?
Well, I have a question for them in a minute. I'm just going off a bit of a tangent. In this thing of diaspora and home and the thing about color and skin, the book that keeps coming to mind, of course, is The English Patient, which is one of my favorite books. Because here you have, in wartime Europe, a man who's charred. So you don't know his skin color. And when I started reading the book, I thought a lesser writer would have made this man being mistaken for an Englishman, and a lesser writer would have turned him out to be either black or brown, which is one of the issues. You know, in Europe, the color of your skin is such an issue. It's kind of strange, but when you live in a majority country where everybody's more or less the same. And he turned his writer, his patient, into a Hungarian. He was white, but his skin was charred. He was speaking fluent English, and they talk of him as an Englishman, and then at the end of it, of course, he turns out to be a Hungarian who's brought up in Britain, and he's on the other side of the war. He's a spy. And I thought, and then one of the main protagonists is also an Indian, a man called Kip, who works with the British. He diffuses bombs, and then he runs off in an absolute rage. Because the Japanese have been bombed, because of the atom bomb, and he says they would not have dropped this bomb on an Asian country. Now that novel, in a way, to me, embodies all these sort of complexities of writing, which is both home and diaspora. And where do you define the author? Do you define him as South Asian? Do you define him as Sri Lankan? Do you define him as Canadian? He has two strong Canadian characters. So I think that embodies a lot of the kind of writing and the questions that the whole issue of home and diaspora raises. Because it's not a book, I think, that would have been written by a person who was not aware of all these complexities of color and difference. But actually, I did have a question, rather than rambling on about my favorite book, which I wondered, all of you say that you don't feel a difference between home and diaspora. I wondered whether any of you actually wrote in two different places. Does it feel different when you're writing at home, or in Pakistan or India, or when you're writing in England? When the process of writing, is it different? Does place make a difference?
You use the word home when you're writing at home.
Yeah, I did, but there's no home in a way.
Well, using that distinction, that home diaspora distinction, where home is a matter of opinion.
I feel equally at home in both places now, and so I feel at home when I'm writing. Wherever I write, I don't think I've ever written in any place other than Pakistan or England. I feel at home.
I think home is a very emotional word, isn't it? It's quite an interesting word, home, compared to diaspora, which is not emotional. So when you ask the question, when you write at home, do you feel differently? I don't know the end of the sentence, from when you write somewhere else. Is that what you mean? Because when you're in the subcontinent, or if you're in a place that feels like home, but isn't home for some other reason, it affects how you write, I guess is what I'm saying. So to simplify, home, what is home? Is home where your family is? Is home where you grew up? Is home where you want to live for an extended period of time? Is home the place that you thought you'd return to, but you decided to make life elsewhere? When my last book I was writing is set in India, and I watched a lot of, I had filmed in India quite a bit, and when I first wrote the book I didn't look at any of that footage because I thought it would be more honest to try and write it from the mind alone, rather than to be hampered by the literal quality of watching video. And in the second draft I watched the video, and the quality of the book rose exponentially, because I was looking for the details of being in India And that's how the verisimilitude of the book grew. Just the small details of what was in the frame, what I could see visually, lent a lot to it. And that wasn't an emotional approach. That wasn't, is this a home or is this not home? That was, this book is about a place in India, and I want to write it with as much commitment to an idea of truth as I can. But I guess that idea of truth is fluid for all of us.
I think
Excuse me, can I just say one thing?
Yes.
Sorry.
No, please.
When you were talking about writing in India, I also feel that when I've only ever written about Pakistan. None of my books has been set in Britain. So my material is here, and I'm writing over there. Mostly I'm writing over there. I notice when I come back, because I hear people speaking, and I'm immersed in my subject matter, like you start picking up many more details that you forget about when you're there. You know them, but because you don't...
I think that's true.
You don't see them, you forget about them and you don't include them. But here they become very telling, very important details. But I find the actual act of writing is perhaps, once I've got all this detail, once I've got my material, it's actually easier to write from a distance. Because then I feel I can be a little bit more objective perhaps, or a little bit more strict with myself. And it's like seeing something, something that's happened to you. When you're experiencing it, it's one emotion, but when years later you think about something, only the most salient things remain with you, and you can get the essence of it. So you keep the detail, but you can also bring out the essence when you're... I find that easier when I'm living abroad.
Well, okay, now, Nikita, you would have, sense of belonging, at least distant when you're in India. You'll pick up the details, as you say, which are resonant in one way or the other. You wouldn't feel that for Sindh, for example, although your family came from here.
No, but it's great to be back, even though I don't feel
That's what I want to know. Do you feel that? Because my mother, for example, came from Australia. She was born and brought up there. Came here. I have no association whatsoever with, in my own consciousness. I'm not sure if that's a rule or not. But now, Nikesh, as I said, has lived his entire life in, may have visited the subcontinent from time to time, I don't know, but you've lived your entire life there. Do you feel those kind of resonances at all, the emotional, the sense of home, of belonging in any way?
Well, as a Londoner of 31 years, I moved out of London for the first time, and it was only once I...
Yeah, you have to.
Okay, I can't hear myself either, so I'm sorry. None of us can hear me. Is this an okay volume? Shall I talk? Okay. I feel like I'm shouting. Am I shouting? Okay. If I'm shouting, just put up your hands and I'll go softer. I am a Londoner. I feel like I identify with being a Londoner first. And it was only when I moved out of London that I was able to write about it properly. And part of me really, my father's from Kenya, and I really want to write a book about Kenya, but I don't feel like I lived there for a year, but I don't feel like I know it enough. I don't feel like I know it in the same way that Nikita was talking about how she researched writing about India. I don't feel like I've lived it enough or have the insight yet to pick out the little things, the textures. So it's a book that I will probably write in the next 10 years, in the next 15 years, and yeah.
I wanted to say something about belonging. Not specifically to the writers here, but I find that a lot of writers who perhaps grew up here have elements of this experience, and they transmute it into something else. So in a sense, the language and the writing becomes the belonging. You know, I mean, I mentioned Zulfikar Ghaus as a prime example because he's very conscious of language, but that is his home. He really left Sialkot when he was 7, then he went to Bombay, and he left at 17, then he went to England, then he settled in America, and he married a Brazilian. And he writes these books on Brazil. And they're not distant because this is, going back to the same point, there's a kind of cultural richness that you bring to your work. And you get something like his Brazilian trilogy, which is actually inspired by an American novel, The Little Big Man by Thomas Berger. But the whole thing is embedded with concepts of the beloved and the seeker, which is so deeply rooted in subcontinental literature. But he doesn't think, I don't think, he thinks of himself at Pakistan, he had crisis in the middle. But the language and what he's doing with it and his imagination becomes his place of lodging. I don't know if others feel this way.
No, I agree with you. I think you create a home in your writing. You create, the act of writing becomes your home as well. When you ask later, where do I feel at home when writing? You know, it's where my desk is. The desk becomes your country as well. And you bring to it what you carry in your heart and your head. But at your desk, something new happens. At least that's what happens, I hope happens with me.
Is it that we, from the subcontinent, from South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, is it that even when we move out in the rest of the world, even generations later, do we drag our roots around with us much more than most other people and nations do? I think of a writer like Samuel Beckett, for example, conversely, an Irishman, lived in Paris, wrote in French, and completely universal in his, or anti-universal in his approach. There's nothing Irish about Beckett. But Ghaus, on the other hand, did, as you said, rightly carry his roots through 3 continents.
I mean, I don't. I mean, you get a lot of English writers who did English. I mean, James Baldwin lived in south of France, as far as I know.
Yes.
And I think Anthony Burgess lived somewhere in the Mediterranean also. So I think that's a very individual thing. I don't think we do so more than anybody else, but I think what you were born and where you grew up, it does shape you, even if it doesn't manifest itself in obvious ways.
I need some response from the left.
I think that it's interesting because where you grew up, did you? I couldn't hear you very well then, Muneeza. Did you say that it does shape you or it doesn't?
What you were nurtured, it becomes a part of your writing, even if it's not manifested in obvious ways.
Yeah, I think it's about our desire to understand something authentically. That's a kind of a dirty word now, isn't it? Are you authentic or not? So Nikesh was saying his characters were not deemed Asian enough because they listened to hip-hop. And whereas most Asian people I know, who are Indian or Pakistani origin in the UK, who were our age, would have been very heavily into hip-hop and black culture when they were growing up. So it seems totally authentic to me, to a particular kind of experience. So how you write authentically is an important and ongoing subject, because there is a thrill when somebody who grows up in a country writes about it, like, say, Hanif's work. You think, is that integral to the fact that he is from here and has written A Case of Exploding Mangoes about Pakistan? You can't divorce the two, I wonder, even though I'm just aware that we sound a bit like we're all citizens of the world who are constantly roaming the planet and can write a universal experience, which I guess we can. Sometimes, but not always. I don't know. I'll open that up to Nikesh. If you could hear me.
I didn't really hear you. I can't really hear anything, which is why
okay.
I'm not saying anything of any real worth. I apologise for that.
You'll have to get a little closer to the mic.
It's not going to help me hear myself, unfortunately. Yeah, sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Okay.
I was just saying that, what is it to be authentic? Because you felt you were authentic, and you actually linked it to the fact that you had grown up with that experience. Do you think your personal experience leads to authenticity? And is there an excitement in that, I'm saying, when someone writes directly from personal knowledge of what's authentic about a particular cultural grouping, or particular artistic influences, or particular social, economic background, political climate, from direct experience? Is that, I was offering it as a counterpoint to the idea that all experience is universal.
Well, I guess, you know, is my universal experience your universal experience is often the thing that...
Can't hear you, Nikesh. I don't think they can.
Okay. How about that? Is that better? Okay. Is my universal experience your universal experience? And if my universal experience isn't your universal experience, does that mean that my quest for authenticity is different from yours? And obviously, we're all part of the same thing. We're all trying to make sense of the world. We're all trying to make sense of ourselves. And, you know, for other people, you know, be they people, readers, or people in the publishing industry, for them to sort of cast aspersions on what you deem to be your universal experience and what you deem to be authentic is, you know, I find it not only hinders writing, but it sort of hinders the types of discussions you have around writing and what that does for people. So, yeah, I agree with what you said pretty much.
So I think we're getting to quite close to what you were saying earlier, Muneeza. Is there really a distinction at all between home and diaspora? Or are we saying respond to the environment, whatever it is, anywhere you're going to bring with you something from wherever else you are? But I think at this point I need to stop the discussion and throw it open to, we have time for 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Anybody? Do we have a mic somewhere? Anybody has a question? So.
The whole East-West thing, and when there's a critical mass of, say, South Asian writers in the West, they will begin to want to know about these very struggles. Say, for example, I give you, say, Philip Roth. He integrates the whole Jewishness thing with being an American. And there will come a stage, at the moment the West is still hungry, still avid for the Orientalist stereotypes or whatever, it's still needed. It's kind of, perhaps there'll come a point when they'll be sated. I'm talking again about the audience. Are you writing for the audience in South Asia? Are you writing for the West? Are you writing for a literate, is it literary fiction, which is a different thing from page-turning sort of fiction? There are all these different, again, the generational things. You young people are of a different generation, perhaps. So there's a generational thing. You've grown up in the West. So there's so many conflicting strands in this whole debate, and I don't think they've been teased out and clarified. And one is left slightly perplexed about, what home means different things to all of you.
Because we're all different people. We're all different people with different loves and different experiences, and I'm writing for everyone. I don't sit down and write a book with a specific market in mind. I'm writing a book that's for my people's den, for everyone, for anyone who wants to read it. I don't restrict. If I restricted myself from the point of writing, I'm only going to write this book for people who are Asian from London. That is like 200 people, if that, and they're mostly my family, and I don't want them to read my books. And B, what about everyone else in the world? You know, so, what I want is to write something that transcends, that cuts through to everyone, and not just for people of the diaspora, not just for people from South Asia. What about people in Japan, in Russia, in Kenya, in Bolivia? Do you know what I mean? That's what I'm going for. And, you know, whether I'm successful or not is another thing, but, you know, that's how I write.
But it's again the question of which shelf are they going to put you on? And they can
But that's a decision that's out of my control.
Yeah.
I've got...
complexity of those different strands.
Could I just say something to this?
Muneeza, I think... sorry, I beg your pardon.
I've got an answer to that, which is, I'll try and give an honest answer. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Great. There's a difference for me between my first and my second book. So when I wrote my first book, it's called Gifted, and it was published in the UK. The first step is, you don't believe you'll be published when you write your first novel. You just think, I dream of being published. I'm just going to write the book that I want to write. And the reader is totally imaginary, I think. Anyone who believes that they're writing with an audience in mind with their first novel is very confident that the audience exists, that the book is going to leave your bedroom where you're writing in your pajamas, that you're going to be so sophisticated that you imagine an audience from a diaspora audience or in Japan. You know, you're really working at the top of your game if you're unpublished and thinking, who is my audience, I think. And so after that, there is a loss of innocence because you've been published. So my aim was, growing up because I grew up in the UK, even though I was born in India, to be published by a British publisher. That was the aim. That happened, and the book is about an Indian girl growing up in Wales, in Cardiff, so not in England, in the Welsh area, and the book sold in many different languages. So it's sold in Romania, it's translated into Romanian, to Polish, Italian, French. It sold in Canada, but I'm thinking of the other translations. It's also translated into Hindi, Punjabi, Marathi, and these kinds of languages. I couldn't have foreseen that could happen to such a particular experience, which is a small child who's a maths prodigy growing up in Wales. It's a novel about a girl coming of age, so what it is to go through adolescence, what is it to grow up in a family environment. It's a novel about maths, because she's good at maths and way above her age group. And I never would have imagined that something that specific could be of interest. And then I went to Poland, and there's a huge level of interest in the book. A lot of media, and in Polish, I couldn't understand it. I mean, I had to have a translator all the time. And you would think how outside of the book or the audience it was imagined for. And it's very exciting for me that it was published in indigenous languages in India. So you can never know what will transcend. And so then when I wrote the second book, I had that in mind. So you have an audience in mind then. If that's an honest answer, you try not to, because you think, oh, it would be so great to be pure again, and to not have been deflowered, you know, in that way. But basically you imagine an audience. But for me, it was a nebulous audience then, and it wasn't located in one country because of my initial experience.
It's interesting.
Hello, I have just one more question.
Anyone else?
Can I go ahead?
Yes.
My question is that why is the image...
Hold the mic a little closer, please.
I'm sorry?
Hold the mic a little closer to your mouth, please.
Okay, sorry. My question is that why isn't there more experimental literature from first generation writers? I mean, there is some on the Indian side, but not much on the Pakistani side. It's the same tropes that are repeated again, as far as the ones I've read. It is like you said, the mango literature and the terrorism is not experimental at all writing, or are there any that I've missed? Would you know about that, or is it not being published?
Well, what do you mean? Who do you define as first generation?
I'm sorry?
Who do you define as first generation?
First generation, like somebody like Nikhil, or somebody who's grown up there.
Oh, you mean first generation Britain as opposed to first generation
Maybe
of
second generation.
Indian English?
Writers who've grown up abroad or who were born abroad and have been writing.
And you think that they're writing about mangoes? Actually, I mean, the way I have seen it, it seems to me quite different. What I've seen, and they're not necessarily, I mean, first or second generation is a little sort of confusing because it depends on each family. You might be first generation for one family, you might be third or fourth generation for another, because actually, contrary to popular belief, Desis have been living in Britain for hundreds of years. And some of them have got amalgamated, and some of them are conscious of these roots. But I think that a lot of the South Asian writing which is coming out which addresses issues in Britain, first generation Britain rather than Pakistan, they're not necessarily pandering to stereotypes as we think they are. What they're actually doing is challenging the existing British or American narrative of what immigrants are, what immigrant life should be, what immigrants are about. Hanif Kureshi was one of the earliest. All right, he writes about working class life, but he was very strongly presenting a point of view which was very different to what British playwrights were writing about Britain. And it was at a time when there were a lot of race riots in Britain in the 1980s. And what he was trying to tell them was why these race riots are happening, why the Asians are feeling marginalized, why are they not being treated as mainstream Britain? They've grown up here, they're British. So that is the kind of, when you're talking about British writing, there was a whole issue of Britishness. And then, of course, there was otherwise, what had they read about the subcontinent? They read Forster and they read Kipling. So a lot of them, when they reclaimed or wrote about their homelands, their memories. Let's talk about myself. I was a child, I went to Britain, I was there from the 9 to 19. I cannot think of a single book that I read by an English writer which even remotely resembled the world that I had inhabited in Pakistan. There was no one I knew in those characters. There was, at the best there was, Mowgli, okay. There was Dr. Aziz. Well, Dr. Aziz, there might be he didn't resemble people I knew. It's, there was the Kipling characters. So these writers were actually, and this was my engagement with this literature, was to find a literature which portrayed the real world that we inhabited. So I don't think they are actually, despite all this thing about publishing and shopkeepers and putting things here, I mean, that's the shopkeepers. I don't think the writer actually, a writer worth his salt really engages with that. No, I haven't.
Can we take a question from there? One moment.
This is very exciting to hear because I'm less familiar with writing by people from Pakistan and India and the diaspora. I think it's very exciting. I'm interested to hear that you say, if I ask you, that your material is often based here, though you're writing in where your desk is. Do you think that might change and that your material will also become where your desk is in the UK, for all of you, so that it will move away from the immediate diaspora to the general public? And second is, I was excited to hear about translations into South Asian languages of your novel. And do you think that's going to happen more and more? Because I notice in India that the very successful Indian writing in English, what an ugly term, they don't really get translated into the Indian languages. I mean, Chumpa Lahiri, who wrote this huge new novel on a very important movement and moment in Bengal's life, the Naxalite movement in the lowland. Is that going to be translated into Bengali? So I think then if translations happen, it becomes even more enriching because then you really have a dialogue going.
Who wants to take that? Or give a remark there.
I think the issue of translation is an interesting one. Sorry, did I interrupt?
No, go ahead.
Because it also comes back to those translations into the Indian languages. Who can afford them? So the way that they're published, it comes back to economics too, because they're still quite expensive as a model in the publishing industry for, say, someone who would regularly read in Marathi, maybe may not always be able to buy it. So there's some work that needs to go on there in the cross-fertilization and the translation back and forth that's around the economic model. What were you going to say before I interrupted?
Not really, because I think we have to call it, we have to close the session now, so we have another question I'm missing? Well, a quick one, please, because we have to close the session now.
Okay, it is very quick. I mean, I think what you're saying about home and diaspora. Hear me now? Yeah. Blurring is really interesting, and I think. Sorry about this. As I understand it, many of the people who are writing in Britain today, who perhaps people think are diaspora writers, are perhaps, I'm no good at this either, are perhaps as British as they are South Asian. They may be the products of mixed so-called marriages, you know, one parent may be British, the other of South Asian extraction. So I think in their work, they do exactly what you're saying, which is to sort of shatter that frontier, that boundary between home and diaspora. I don't know if you, because I think you've kind of not commented on that kind of writer, perhaps. Hanif Kureshi being one of them. He's as British as he was ever Pakistani.
Yes. Anybody want to make a remark there? Actually, I don't think we have the time because we have to hand this all to somebody else. And can I close the session for this session? Those of you who may be interested, by the way, we have some poets, Pakistani poets, which will be in the Princess, where I have to go now. So thank you very much. Thank you to my panelists, and thank you to the audience.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.